There's a kind of Texas afternoon that tells you nothing is coming. The morning of May 27th, 1997 was one of them. Hot, humid to the point of discomfort, a sky that was mostly sun, a ridge of high pressure settling in overhead, and a warm lid of air pressed down over central Texas like a hand on a pot, holding everything still. Meteorologists call that lid a cap, and on a day like that, it feels like protection. The storms from the night before had rolled off to the east. The air was heavy, but the sky was quiet. If you lived in the little town of Jarrell, 40 minutes north of Austin, you did what you always did. You went to work, you opened the store, you let the kids ride their bikes in the last of the school year. Nobody watched that sky the way you watch a sky in a horror movie because there was nothing to watch. The setup that day was missing the very things forecasters look for before the worst tornadoes. The upper winds were weak. The wind shear that normally organizes a storm into a killing machine was almost absent. By every rule in the book, this was a day for heat and maybe some hail. Not for the most violent tornado most Americans have never heard of, but the atmosphere had loaded one number to a level that should have terrified everyone who saw it. And by the time anyone understood what that number meant, the ground itself was being pulled up by the roots. Today, we are going to walk through the Jarrell tornado. Not just what it did, though what it did is almost impossible to believe. But why, more than 25 years later, meteorologists still pull this exact storm off the shelf and study it, argue about it, and admit quietly that it broke rules they thought could not be broken. This is not a story about a town that ignored the warnings. Jarrell heard the warnings. That is part of what makes it so haunting. Before we get into it, if you are the kind of person who wants to understand the thing everyone else just fears, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel more than you would think. And I want to know one thing while you are here. Where are you watching from right now? Which part of the country? Which stretch of storm country? Drop your town in the comments. I read them. Now let's get into it. Start with that one number. Meteorologists have a measurement called CAPE, which stands for Convective Available Potential Energy. In plain terms, it's the amount of fuel in the atmosphere, the raw energy available to lift air violently upward and build a thunderstorm. On a strong spring day in Texas, you might see values in the range of a couple thousand. On May 27th, some measurements over central Texas ran far higher than that, into territory that is genuinely rare. The air was almost unimaginably unstable. There was a dew point reading that morning of 82 degrees, which is the kind of tropical soupy moisture that turns the whole lower atmosphere into a loaded spring. So you had a strange, dangerous imbalance. Almost no wind shear, which is supposed to mean no organized tornadoes, but an absurd amount of raw fuel held down by that tap. And into that mix, the atmosphere threaded a few small, subtle features that most people have never heard of. A cold front draped down through the state, a dry line running nearly parallel to it just a few miles away, and a faint ripple in the atmosphere called a gravity wave, a kind of invisible swell rolling in from decayed storms up in Oklahoma and Arkansas. None of those things is dramatic on its own, but they all arrived at the same place just north of Waco around noon, and they cracked the cap. When that lid broke, all that stored fuel went straight up. A storm exploded into the sky over central Texas, and because the winds steering it were so weak and so oddly arranged, the storm did something that alone would make this event strange. It moved the wrong way. Almost every significant tornado in the United States travels toward the northeast, because that is the direction the upper-level winds carry these storms. This one drifted toward the southwest, backwards. It crawled down the Interstate 35 corridor against the grain of everything a storm is supposed to do, spinning up smaller tornadoes as it went, edging closer to a subdivision called Double Creek Estates on the northwest edge of Jarrell. At around 3:40 in the afternoon, roughly 3 miles north of town, a thin rope of a funnel dropped out of the base of that storm, wrapped in dust. For a few minutes it looked almost harmless, a pale thread wobbling over the fields near the highway. The Texas Highway Patrol stopped traffic on both sides of Interstate 35, expecting it to cross the interstate. It never did. It ran alongside the highway instead, and as it did, it began to do the thing that turned a strange weather day into one of the darkest days in the state's history. It intensified, not gradually, explosively. In a matter of a minute or two, that pencil-thin rope ballooned into a massive churning wedge, wrapped in several smaller vortices spinning around a single violent core. Photographers on the ground caught it in this stage, and one image became so famous it named a whole category of tornado. In the photo, the multiple vortices looked like enormous legs, a dark shape striding across the Texas prairie. People started calling it Dead Man Walking. It is one of the most chilling weather photographs ever taken, and it was captured in the minutes before the tornado reached the homes. Here is what makes Jarrell different from almost every other violent tornado, and it comes down to a single word: slow. Most tornadoes are a passing event. Even a monster is usually moving 30, 40, 50 miles an hour. So the very worst winds are over a given house in seconds. Jarrell was not moving 30 miles an hour. As it settled over Double Creek Estates, it slowed to something like 5 to 10 miles an hour, barely faster than a person walking. And then, over the neighborhood, it slowed even further, almost to a crawl. For roughly 3 full minutes, the most extreme winds ever surveyed sat nearly stationary, directly on top of people's homes. 3 minutes does not sound like a long time until you understand what F5 winds do in 3 seconds. The estimates for this tornado ran to more than 260 miles an hour. Now hold that over a house, and hold it there, and don't move. The result was not what most people picture when they picture tornado damage. There were no piles of broken lumber. There was no debris field of couches and drywall and shingles. In the worst hit heart of Double Creek Estates, there was almost nothing left at all. 38 homes stood in that subdivision. Many were well built. Some were properly bolted to their foundations, the way you are supposed to build them. It did not matter. The homes in the direct path were not knocked down. They were swept completely off their slabs and granulated, reduced to fragments so small that when rescuers arrived, they nearly drove past the neighborhood without realizing houses had ever been there. Investigators from the National Weather Service later wrote that the most striking thing about the scene was the near total absence of debris of any size. The pieces that remained were tiny, scattered, unrecognizable. The force had ripped the plumbing and pipes out from underneath the concrete slabs. It tore the pavement 3 inches thick off of 3 separate county roads. It scoured the grass and the topsoil right off the earth, in some places down to 18 inches deep, leaving long swaths of bare mud where lawns and pastures had been. The details from the survey read like something invented. Vehicles were thrown more than 300 yards, crushed and caked in mud and scoured grass, and several cars were never found at all, apparently torn into pieces too small to identify. Hundreds of cattle in the surrounding fields were killed. Trees were stripped completely of their bark. One small tree was documented with an electrical cord driven straight through its trunk. This is what F5 means at its absolute ceiling, not a house blown apart, a place erased. And this is the part that stays with you. Jarrell was not caught off guard. A tornado watch had been issued hours earlier. A tornado warning went out for Williamson County more than 20 minutes before the tornado reached town. The sirens in Jarrell sounded 10 to 12 minutes before impact. The tornado was enormous and slow and clearly visible against the sky, so people could actually see it coming for a long time. Many residents knew exactly what was bearing down on them. Some got in their cars and drove away from its path, and that choice saved their lives. Others did precisely what we are all told to do. They went to the innermost room. They got in the bathtub. They gathered their families at the center of the house and held on. In the core of the worst damage, doing everything right was not enough. Investigators noted something almost unheard of. In the very heart of the path, the survival rate for anyone sheltering above ground was essentially zero. There were no basements in these homes, built as they were on Texas slab. There was nowhere lower to go. 27 people were killed, every single one of them in Double Creek Estates. Entire families were lost together. The tornado took the Ego family, took the Moerings, took whole households in a matter of minutes on a single street. In the aftermath, the destruction was so complete that responders struggled at first to tell human remains from the cattle. The governor of Texas at the time, George W. Bush, came to see it and called the damage mind-boggling. A temporary morgue was set up by the volunteer fire department in a town that had, in one afternoon, lost a piece of itself that would never quite grow back. Then, 13 minutes after it began, the tornado crossed into a stand of cedar trees, weakened and lifted. 5 miles of track, 13 minutes, and in the middle of it, 3 minutes that rewrote what people thought a tornado could physically do. So why do meteorologists still study this one, out of all the violent tornadoes in American history? Because Jarrell should not have happened, at least not the way the textbooks said. Violent, long-track tornadoes are supposed to require strong wind shear to organize them. Jarrell formed in an environment with weak shear and got its power instead from that off-the-charts instability, that enormous reservoir of fuel. That combination challenged a basic assumption about how the worst tornadoes are made, and researchers have gone back to it again and again, using it to study how you can get a monster in conditions that don't look monstrous on the morning forecast. There was no clean, classic hook echo on radar right before it hit. Mobile Doppler radar, the tool that now lets scientists measure tornado winds directly, was in its infancy in 1997, and none of it was pointed at this storm. So the winds could only be estimated from the damage, and the damage was so far beyond the normal scale that engineers at the National Institute of Standards and Technology used Jarrell to argue about the tornado rating scale itself, about how construction quality and wind speed and destruction actually relate. Programs like the Vortex Tornado Research Projects have leaned on Jarrell as the extreme case, the outlier, the storm that tells you the edges of what's possible are farther out than you thought. And there's a quieter reason it endures. Jarrell is the most recent F5 tornado to strike the state of Texas. As of today, in a state that sees more tornadoes than almost anywhere on Earth, nothing since 1997 has matched it. It sits at the far end of the record, like a marker, the ceiling, the storm every meteorologist in the region measures other storms against. So here is what this story is really about. Not fear, and not the idea that the sky is out to get you. The vast majority of Texas storms are survivable, and the warnings that day worked exactly as designed. This is about the gap between what a morning tells you and what an afternoon can hold. It's about a day that broke almost every rule we use to predict danger and produced, in the span of 3 minutes, something so violent that the Earth still carried the scar for years and the science still carries the questions. Drive out to Double Creek Estates now, and the grass has grown back over the bare mud. New homes stand where the old ones were wiped away. Some of the survivors rebuilt on the very same land, on the same streets where they lost their neighbors, because that is what people do. There is a memorial nearby with 27 trees, one for every person who died, planted on land that belonged to a family the storm took whole. And somewhere in the weather records of Central Texas is a single ordinary spring morning, hot, humid, sunny. A cap holding everything still, and a sky that told the people beneath it there was nothing at all to watch for. The oldest lesson these storms teach is the one Jarrell taught hardest. The surface of an afternoon tells you almost nothing about what the air above it is holding. Waiting. The way it waited over a quiet Texas town that never saw, in that calm and cloudless morning, the one number that meant everything.